No one between St. Paul and Martin Luther shaped the church more than a man from North Africa named Augustin. His conversion to the faith was as dramatic as his thought, which seems to have come to bear upon virtually every aspect of the Christian church, and his powerful influence persists right up to the present. Some of his writings are included among the world's great literature, and entire encyclopedias have been devoted to him. Though African, he has maintained universal appeal. Though a churchman, his sphere of influence includes politics. Though dead now for almost 1700 years, it is as though he still lives. What is the stature of this man measured by? In which ways do his dry bones yet speak to the church and to the modern Christian? As Bishop of Hippo, he guided the church there through some troubled waters, but never lost sight of the larger picture of the evolving Christian church. His autobiography, The Confessions, is still read and provides an unparalleled glimpse into the life of a Christian pilgrim. Perhaps the most human of all the fathers, and the least palatable to the modern age, nonetheless his legacy remains. The Christian church owes much to St. Augustine and his legacy.
Thou hast made us for thyself, and our hearts are restless until they find rest in thee. Famous words written by one of the most famous personalities in all of church history, written in one of the most well-known and famous books. Of course, that man was St. Augustine of Hippo. Augustine is historically at the end of one era, as it were, with one foot in the age of the church fathers and the other foot almost in the Middle Ages. He's a transitional figure. He's the last of the great patristic fathers, which we spoke about in the last lecture. Men like Origen, Jerome, John Chrysostom, and Athanasius that we talked about in some detail. Augustine goes right along with those people. He is probably, in the minds of some, because of his continuing influence, maybe the greatest of all the church fathers. At the time of his birth, which was in the year 354, the Roman Empire had long since passed its prime. It was still a vast colossus, standing astride most of Europe, Asia Minor, extending through Syria and Palestine, and including all of North Africa, which is where Augustine was born. It was a territory really too large to administer, over 2.5 million square miles is the geography of the Roman Empire, and attempting to govern its population, which numbered some 66 million inhabitants, to say nothing of the numerous barbarians who were living, or should I say lurking, on the boundaries and on the borders of the Roman Empire, was really quite impossible. And it was past its prime anyway. Solidarity within this world power had long disappeared. Allegiance, clearly demonstrable in North Africa, where Augustine is, was really to the provinces, not to Rome itself any longer as the capital of the great superpower of those early centuries. And many factors were coming together to create a governmental and social situation that was vastly complex and completely unwieldy. Into this world of disintegration, of some chaos and increasing confusion, stepped this man named Augustine. He was the Bishop of Hippo eventually. And Hippo, what remains of that town, is in the present country of Algeria, northern Africa. In the foreground, you see the ancient ruins of Hippo, as Augustine would have known it, and in the background on the hill, the modern church of St. Augustine. He was completely enthralled with philosophy And I mention this at the beginning because as we look at his life's work and his thought, we'll be able to detect the influence of philosophy. He converted to Manichaeanism, and he remained in that sect for 9 years. He later converted to Christianity. He was converted to the Christian faith by Ambrose, the bishop in Milan in northern Italy, and was baptized by the same Ambrose in the year 387. He goes back to North Africa and founded a monastery at Hippo. And it's with this town where Augustine's life will be tied up for most of the rest of it, where his fame is in fact engendered. In the year 391, he was ordained a Christian priest. When the bishop of Hippo died, it was St. Augustine who was elevated in either the year 395 or 396. And in his lifetime, he had to confront 3 great controversies in this period of church history, namely the heresies of Manichaeanism, which he at one time had been a member of, the Donatist controversy, and the Pelagian conflict. But before we get to some of those conflicts, before we talk about his thought, I want to say something about his autobiography, as it were, something about the man himself, because it is often interesting to note that our own experiences shape the people that we become. And the sorts of crises that we deal with in our own lives often have a dramatic effect upon our thinking and upon the way in which we understand, in this case, the faith and God and the church. I quoted from his book, The Confessions, when I began this lecture, and it's to this autobiography written by Augustine himself that we learn a great deal about his early life. In this book, The Confessions, which he wrote around the year 401, he tells us more about his early life and about his struggles than practically any other figure from late antiquity or early Christianity. In fact, it's quite a remarkable read. And before his conversion, he tells us that he had a very tumultuous sex life. He kept a concubine, in fact, for 13 years, and they together had a son. Now his mother, Monica, had a significant influence upon him. We don't know the name of his wife. His mother, Monica, had a great influence upon her son, Augustine. And it's actually Monica who finally persuaded him to get rid of his common law wife, and he sent her away. He writes about that experience, which was very traumatic, in the Confessions, and I quote, he says, "Meanwhile I was sinning more and more. The woman with whom I had been living was torn from my side as an obstacle to my marriage." We'll get to what that means in just a moment. "And was a blow," losing her was a blow, "which crushed my heart to bleeding because I loved her dearly." She went back to Africa, vowing never to give herself to any other man, and left me with the son whom she had borne me. Well, this vow to never enter into another physical relationship that his anonymous common-law wife made could not be said of Augustine. His mother arranged for him to enter into a proper marriage, and this is what he means when he said, "I had to get rid of her because she was an obstacle to my marriage." A legitimate marriage, this new one that his mother arranged, but there was a problem. Augustine tells us what the problem was in his Confessions. "I was impatient at the delay of 2 years, which had to pass before the girl whom I had asked to marry became my wife. And because I was more a slave of lust than a true lover of marriage, I took another mistress without sanction of wedlock." St. Augustine. Now, the 2-year delay was occasioned because the bride-to-be wasn't old enough to get married. She was only 12 years old. And by the custom of the time, girls had to be 14. That was the minimum age for matrimony at that time in that culture. So, Augustin couldn't wait 2 years to have a wife, so he takes another mistress. And in his Confessions, it's because of this that he prays that famous prayer, Lord, give me chastity, but not yet. So he really wants to do what's right. There's been a Christian influence in his life, principally through his mother, but as he puts it himself, I was more a slave of lust than I was a lover of marriage and that sort of relationship. Now, out of his own experience, and much more could be said about his struggle with sexuality, and I will say something more about it in a little bit further into the lecture, it's out of his experience that much later he will create what is known as the Catholic rule with respect to marriage. And I want to read a passage out of his book on the good of marriage. Married people owe each other, Augustin writes, not only the faithfulness of sexual intercourse for the purpose of procreating children, and this is the first association of the human race in this mortal life, but also the mutual service of sustaining each other's weaknesses for the avoidance of illicit intercourse. In marriage, intercourse for the purpose of generation has no fault attached to it, but for the purpose of satisfying concupiscence, provided with a spouse, because of the marriage fidelity, it is a venial sin. Adultery or fornication, however, is a mortal sin. And so, continence from all intercourse is certainly better than marital intercourse itself, which takes place for the sake of begetting children. Now, if you follow what he's saying here, he's making allowance for marriage and sexual intercourse to perpetuate the human race. But still, having sex within marriage apart from begetting children is a sin, according to Augustine. A venial sin, a minor sin, but still a sin. I suggest, and this will be made a little bit clearer when we turn to an analysis of some of his thought, that it's his experiences, his guilt, his own shame over his own sexual activity before he was married that caused him to shape theology, particularly on the doctrine of humankind and marriage and sexuality in the way in which he did. I would like to be a little bit clearer on this point for the simple reason that it is very essential in understanding this idea in the history of Christianity. Sex was, from his own autobiography, his particular compulsion. And since this was his addiction, if I might use that more modern term, it was also from this that he became freed at the time of his conversion. Now, I'm going to resist the temptation to psychologize a man who lived 1600 years ago. But this much can be said. Sex, physical love, and the loss of his mistress haunted him through the rest of his life. I quote from his Confessions. Furthermore, the wound that I had received when my first mistress was wrenched away showed no signs of healing. He's writing years later. Showed no signs of healing. At first the pain was sharp and searing, but then the wound began to fester. And though the pain was duller, there was all the less hope of a cure. Now, here's a situation that a man has experienced that he writes about years later that is still, in fact, haunting him. And he writes about it very profoundly. In Milan, struggling with these difficulties, and we need to focus on this to understand how his career is in fact developing. He's in Milan, dealing with these difficulties, dealing with these struggles, when he hears a child singing in the garden outside the place where he's staying. And the child is singing Tolle Lege, which literally means take up and read, take up and read. And Augustin, in his struggle, hearing the sound of the child's voice singing, pick up and read, he turns and behold, he sees a book. And he picks it up. And would you believe it is the letter written by St. Paul the Apostle to the Christians at Rome. And he opens the book and his eyes fall to a passage and he reads in Romans 13, not in reveling and drunkenness, not in debauchery and licentiousness, not in quarreling and jealousy, but put on the Lord Jesus Christ and make no provision for the flesh to gratify its lusts. Well, this was like a word from God literally that came to him. In the middle of this struggle, he has this illumination, this insight. Put on Jesus, make no provision for the flesh. He took it as literally as Origen took the injunction to make oneself a eunuch for the kingdom of God's sake. Eventually, to go through much more detail, which you can read about in his confessions, he overcame his demons. And he became a bishop, and later a church father. Now there were several influences upon him, which I want to just underscore briefly. First of all, the influences upon Augustine would include the piety of his mother, Monica. His father was not a Christian, but his father was baptized on his deathbed. That's one influence, his mother. A second influence upon the young Augustine, who's growing into manhood, was philosophy, especially with the problem of truth. A third influence, in brief, was Manichaeanism, with its emphasis upon dualism, good versus evil, light versus darkness. And Augustine tended to see things in dualistic terms, either or, not both and, but either sexual debauchery or purity in Christ. And the two he just had difficulty seeing having any relationship. Skepticism was another influence, and I'm speaking of the philosophical tradition. Neoplatonism, mysticism, in other words, was something that influenced Augustine's thought. Another influence would be church authority. And here I refer to the Bishop of Milan, Ambrose. St. Ambrose, to give you an idea of the church authority he exerted, actually compelled the emperor to do penance publicly before admitting him to communion because of a massacre that the emperor had allowed to happen in Thessaloniki in Greece. And when Ambrose heard about it, he thought to himself, this isn't right. The emperor comes to church for communion, and as it were, Ambrose meets him at the door and says, no, until you repent of your sin and of your atrocities and do penance, you shall not receive the body and blood of Jesus. And the emperor capitulated. So, church authority. And the other thing I want to mention is asceticism. And that's a topic that I will not deal with in this lecture because it comes up very much in our discussion of monasticism in the next lecture. The one thing that's missing as a significant influence upon St. Augustine is reason, or the influence of Aristotle. But now let us ask ourselves, what did Augustine have to say about theology? Now, by way of departure, it's fair to say that Augustine esteemed theology higher than any of the other disciplines. We see this reflected in the theory of education in the Middle Ages, which was influenced by St. Augustine. The hill of knowledge, for example, shown in this Florentine miniature, of the late 15th century, which can be seen in a museum in France, depicts education as progress up a hill. The hill was steep, but well trodden in the Middle Ages. The traditional 7 liberal arts are here painted in the style of Botticelli, with a lovely Renaissance doorway at the bottom. Each liberal art in the medieval system is represented allegorically, with her most famous exponent sitting at her feet. At the bottom, outside the gate, we find grammar. Of all the other arts, the way and the gate, it welcomes the young aspiring student. The grammarian who sits writing is the Roman Donatus. Next comes arithmetic, gathering reeds, represented by Pythagoras. Then logic, holding a scorpion, represented by Zeno. Music plays an organ with Tubal Cain hammering on an anvil. Astronomy holds a sphere with Ptolemy beneath her. Next comes geometry with compass and Euclid. Then appears rhetoric, represented by the great Roman orator Cicero. And then just below the summit of the hill of knowledge sits, guess who? Augustin, who had first given the whole allegory a Christian meaning. It was he who made theology rather than philosophy the highest branch of knowledge, the queen of the sciences, theology is called in the Middle Ages. All the other disciplines lead upwards to theology in the Augustinian schema. On the hill of knowledge, theology is a woman, shown here holding a triangle in one hand, symbolic of the Holy Trinity, and with the other hand she points upward into the heavens where God sits enthroned. Augustine emerges as one of the great teachers of theology in the Christian church. So, having said some things now about his life, let us look in turn at several points of his major ideas. The first thing is God. What to be said about God in the system of Augustine? Well, for Augustine, God is the highest, the ultimate being, the creator. And Augustine is really more interested in unity in the Godhead than in the different hypostases, the 3 persons that constituted the doctrine of the Trinity, that constitute the being of God, according to Trinitarian theology. In fact, on the Trinity, it's Augustine who will say, the Trinity is analogous to memory, intelligence, and will. For Augustine, God created the world out of nothing, because the creator of everything was the Almighty God. And Augustine said, almost in a pithy sort of way, I want to know God and the soul. Nothing more. That's what I want to know, is God. Now, on the subject of humankind, the decisive function in humankind, according to Augustine, is the will. The will. Augustine's thought, of course, becomes very influential on the Western Church. Now, when we speak about humans, keep in mind that he thinks the will is what's very important, in fact, most important. To be excluded from the presence of God is hell. Now, that doesn't mean that Augustine didn't believe in hell. Recall that Origen wasn't sure there was a hell, and if there was a hell, that it might not really be eternal. But Augustine thinks that separation from the presence of God constitutes hell in itself. Unbaptized children don't go to hell. According to St. Augustine, they go to limbo, which was a patristic doctrine that some of the fathers held. But as alluded to earlier, Augustine's views on human sexuality become the gateway through which his whole understanding of humanity and even sin is articulated, and this has a profound effect upon the church. He agonized in his confessions and elsewhere in his writings over the shame of those who appeared to have no control over their sexual organs, who suffered, as he put it, suffered from fantasies and sensual dreams. He agonized over, and he's speaking out of his own experience, for this had been his particular experience, and for years he had battled the demons of the flesh. He felt very clear that the sex act constituted venial sin, a necessary evil if the human race is going to go on, but a sin nonetheless, and an eternal reminder of rebellion against God. Sex is bad, according to Augustin. Reproduction is worse, and here we see the Manichaean influence on him. And reproduction is worse because what you're doing when you reproduce children is imprisoning more souls in flesh, in bodies. And this is lower than our goal, which is to transcend the world and the flesh and arrive in the presence of God. But he has to concede that reproduction is the only justification for sex. Now, the physical act itself isn't sinful, St. Augustine says, but the sin lies in the excitement of the passion. And so he took steps to minimize the danger. No woman, not even his own sister, could see him except in the presence of other people. Going to minimize the danger? He's got a problem with women. Let's be blunt about it. He doesn't want to be alone with any woman, not even his own sister, anywhere, lest the demons of sex and the flesh come upon him. It would seem that Augustine's decision for Christ and his decision for Christianity was a decision against his own sexuality. He saw them diametrically opposed. He was convinced that human sexuality had been perverted by the fall. Sexual expression was embarrassing then for him, and the shame that he felt in his younger years become part of his theology and his writings, and his influence on this point for the history of Christianity is astonishingly influential. In paradise, Adam and Eve were naked, and their genitals were under complete control. At least that's what St. Augustine thought. There either wasn't any sex at all in the Garden of Eden, or if there was, it was really just a regulated bodily function like anything else. But after the fall, after Adam and Eve fell into sin and transgression and listened to the serpent, ate of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, then the sexual impulse became a lustful one, and the genitals lost their, shall we say, docility, and seemed to take on a mind of their own. And this bothered Augustine, because when he became a Christian, he still struggled with his sexual desires. His doctrine of human then turns on the problem of sexuality, and he struggled his entire life in a quest to find a proper solution. Now, on the problem of sin, which of course comes immediately right out of the doctrine of humankind, you can hardly speak of one without speaking of the other, there were several concepts with which Augustine was familiar with respect to sin. Neoplatonic thought said that sin is the absence of good. So if there's no good there, then there's automatically sin. Hebrew ideas taught that sin was rebellion against God. It's not just a matter of the absence of good, it's active knowledge and rebellion against God. Augustine appears to take these two ideas and put them together in his own theory, that sin is the absence of good and it's also rebellion. So it's both things. In Neoplatonic thought, evil is not an entity in itself. St. Augustine agreed. And he also postulated that perfection in this life was quite impossible. And Augustine would, before his days were done, wage a running battle against others who thought differently on the matter, as we will see a little bit later. But in the end, he was inclined to reject the idea of traducianism. Traducianism, a big word which simply implies the theory that sin is inherited from our parents genetically. In the end, he tended to reject that and saw sin tied up with will. See, that's the key thing for St. Augustine. The human will is tainted and corrupted. Another area in which St. Augustine appears to have articulated thought which becomes very important is on the subject of predestination. He taught that God predestined some to eternal life. He did not, however, promote a theory of double predestination. That is to say that before the creation of the world, God decided who would go to heaven and who would go to hell. Augustine said God has chosen some to go to heaven. Augustine taught that God's foreknowledge predicted, but did not necessarily preordain the eternal punishment of people not selected for salvation. It will be left to theologians later like John Calvin to boldly go where Augustine did not wish to go, and to simply come right out and say, well, if you haven't been selected to go to heaven, you've obviously been selected to go to hell. Augustine wouldn't take that step. You see this dualism, the saved and the lost. Augustine didn't see much in the middle. You were one or the other. Now this is sharper, this dualism, in Augustine than it is in St. Paul. For Augustine, the church is a mixed company. To use the analogy of Jesus, there are both tares and wheat in the church. And you really can't tell one from the other, and you have to wait until the end of time to find out who are the good and the bad. Indistinguishable. The church is therefore not entirely good or entirely bad. Another subject that should be mentioned, because again the teaching is most influential, has to do with the subject of force. That is to say, with war. In the year 410, Rome, the center of the Christian faith, fell to the invading Visigoths. The Visigoths were a German tribe who were actually Christians, but they were Arian Christians. They sacked Rome in 410. At Bethlehem, another church father, St. Jerome, was profoundly moved by this event. And he said, "My voice sticks in my throat. The city that has captivated the world has been taken captive." And he regarded this event as the end of the world. This was a monumental episode in world history. It was a world-changing event which had significant consequences for the history of Christianity itself. St. Augustine felt that Rome fell because of her sins. The sins that had made her great had finally caught up to her, and she fell. Now, against this background of the fall of Rome, the sacking of Rome, Augustine came to accept the Ciceronian view that war is justified under certain conditions. In his great book, The City of God, Augustine sets forth what is known as the just war theory. There's 4 components to the just war theory. First of all, it's under the auspices of the state. In order for a conflict to be just, it has to be under the jurisdiction of the state. Secondly, in order for the conflict to be just, it has to be for the purpose of vindicating justice. Thirdly, the aim of the war, paradoxically, has to be to restore peace. And the 4th component, according to this theory, is that one must keep faith with the enemy. Now, the City of God stands as a book as one of the great epochal works in Western culture. Only a genius could have produced the City of God. It is the last great apology, this book, against paganism, the last great Christian apology against paganism. It's also the final justification of her teaching, the Church's teaching, and her historical position at the end of time and before the whole world. It's one of those texts of great world literature. It's a work well worth becoming acquainted with. But now turning from specific points within the thought of Augustin, we need to look at the three major controversies I mentioned earlier that shaped his writings and shaped his teachings. And the first of the three was Manichaeanism. We know that Augustin was originally attracted to Mani's teaching. So the Manichaeans are the followers of Mani. And he was particularly attracted to Mani's teaching on the subject of the origin and the perpetuation of evil. Mani was a 3rd century Babylonian who taught that humans were created by God, but they were joined unhappily to a material body, a physical body, that had been created by a lesser God. Now recall that Augustine joined the Manichaeans and continued in their teaching for 9 years. Well, in distinction to Mani, Augustine taught a doctrine of original sin, which he included among the essentials of the Christian faith. Often he speaks of evil as a lack of knowledge, but he came to perceive increasingly that evil was endemic in the human will. Well, as far as Augustine was concerned, the human will before the fall was capable of controlling the individual. But the fall, just as it had corrupted sexuality in human beings, corrupted the will. And the will becomes evil because it constituted a defection away from God to the self. Therefore, evil comes from the human will, which is no longer centered in God, but instead seeks its own fulfillment and satisfaction from other objects of desire and delight. And in his book, The City of God, Augustine continues developing this theme. He talks about human futility and the futility of striving apart from God. He develops themes of the intervention of divine grace. The human returns to its source. And all of this is set within time and space. The city of humanity is juxtaposed over against the city of God. That is, the city of humanity is sex, power, and possessions. The city of God, of course, is where God is King and Jesus is Lord. And for the Christian pilgrim, life is the process of moving from the city of humanity to the city of God. This whole saga brings wholeness and salvation, but in a place beyond space and time. Evil is temporary then, and through Christ and beyond this present evil age, the bondage of sin and the bondage of evil is overcome. Now this is effectively a rebuttal against Mani's insistence that evil is necessary and that evil is permanent. So Augustine completely juxtaposes his theory against Mani. So the struggle that he has with the Manichaeans after he defects from them shapes his theology. The second major controversy after Manichaeanism, which engaged Augustine, was the problem of Donatism. And this was largely, but not exclusively, a North African problem. The Donatists taught that the validity of the sacraments depended upon the purity of the priest. And they're called Donatists after one of their leading bishops whose name was Donatus. Well, the Donatist church in North Africa was in fact larger than the Catholic Church or the mainstream church. That's how powerful and influential it was. Its roots were in the episode of a bishop who surrendered holy books to the authorities during the Diocletian persecution in the early 4th century. Those who complied with these repressive measures, who handed over their holy books or who fled away from persecution, became known as the lapsed. They had lapsed from Christianity. The lapsed were regarded by those who had not lapsed as being out of the church. They had forsaken the faith. They had run off, more fearful for their own skin than they were for the integrity of the gospel, and they'd handed over their holy books for heaven's sake. Those of the Donatist persuasion split from the mainstream church in the year 311 when a lapsed priest who came back was made bishop. Now, doctrinally, there was really no difference between the mainstream church and the Donatist churches, but there were issues of ecclesiology that were involved quite obviously. Accordingly, Donatist ecclesiology regarded the church as the bride of Christ without spot or wrinkle, and collaboration with hostile secular authorities or fleeing persecution sullied the church, and neither could be tolerated, not by the Donatists. And when the mainstream church appeared to tolerate certain lapses and seemed willing to make provision for the lapsed people's readmittance to the church, the people known as the Donatists said, enough. Not in our church. And they withdrew. We want to have a church that is pure, without spot or wrinkle. A congregation that is prepared to stand for the truth and the faith. So they taught that the validity of the sacraments was dependent upon the purity of the presiding priest or minister. The Donatists insisted that the sacraments, like baptism, the Eucharist, ordination, performed by suspect ministers, were not just invalid, but they actually contaminated the faithful recipients of the Lord's Supper, of baptism, of ordination. This was a serious charge indeed. So if you were going to come over to the Donatist church, you were actually rebaptized because your first baptism was invalid. It wasn't Christian baptism because you were baptized by a lapsed priest. There were political and social consequences to this conflict. Donatist bakers in Augustin's hometown of Hippo refused to sell bread to Catholics or to mainstream Christians. Some of the Donatist groups were very radical indeed. One of the bishops in the mainstream church, Maximanus, was seized in his own church and stabbed when the church was vandalized. He was then thrown from the tower, but he had the good fortune of landing in a pile of dung, and thus he survived the plunge and lived to tell about his experiences. The Bishop of Calama had his house burned down by rabid Donatists. Radical Donatists would actually enter churches and purify them by scraping the walls, scrubbing the floors, and then drenching everything with water. And I assure you, this was not just a cleaning bee at the local church. No, they were going to purify, just like Puritans in 17th century England would purify the Anglican church and get rid of the Romish decorations. The Donatists wanted to get rid of every trace of these lapsed so-called Christians. Catholics had their eyes plastered with lime and salt and were otherwise publicly humiliated. They forced an elderly bishop to dance on top of his altar table with dead dogs tied around his neck on one occasion. These people were called the Circumcellions, a North African group of radical Christians who might best be described as terror squads within Donatist Christianity. They took the view that those who didn't give their lives in defense of the sacred books were unworthy to be priests, unworthy to administer the gospel of Jesus Christ. The one who isn't holy has no place in the church, in other words. Well, confronted with this crisis, especially on account of the fact that he lived in North Africa, Augustin worked out a response which made sacramental effectiveness dependent not upon the priest or the presiding minister, but on Christ. Hence, the sacraments are valid even if the presiding priest is suspect on any count. The validity of the sacraments don't depend upon the purity of the person celebrating. The official response to the Donatists in terms of the sacraments was the doctrine of ex opere operato, which means that out of the operation it operates. Doesn't matter who's doing it. The sacrament is efficacious and effective because of Jesus Christ. Augustin called the Donatists roaring lions, and he faced them head on, eye to eye. In reply to this problem, Augustin worked out a theology of the church that said the church is imperfect. The church is struggling as it seeks redemption eschatologically, that is, at the end of time and beyond time. He wrote and he worked against the Donatists relentlessly. And by the year 405, an Edict of Unity was published, branding the Donatists heretical. By the year 411, they were forced out of the church altogether. Now this event, and particularly the final expulsion in 411, were profound because it established a model for dealing with future problems. The model looks like this: a powerful institutional church expelling minority groups and suppressing unpopular minority points of view by simply getting rid of them. But that's what happened with the Donatists, and this will be the story over and again through the Middle Ages and right on down through the Reformation. Augustine came to believe that political and legal resolution to problems like these were legitimate. And after this point, he advocated such measures to deal with these kinds of problems. Well, the Manichaeans and the Donatists, the third and the final controversy relating to Augustine's life and work, was the Pelagian controversy, named after its leader, Pelagius, who was a Briton of Celtic background. Pelagius was one thing, Pelagianism is quite another. Just as we learned previously that Origen is one thing and the Origenians are something else. To be blunt, the disciples always pervert the masters. There's Christ and then there's Christians. They're not necessarily the same thing. Calvin and Calvinists, Luther and Lutherans. So when we talk about Pelagius and Pelagianism, you need to keep in mind that they're not necessarily the same thing just because the name is shared. Pelagians taught that there was a human capacity for freedom from sin. You could be free from sin. And there was a human responsibility and a human role in salvation. Pelagius himself apparently taught that humans were capable of choosing and working towards perfection. Now you can see who's going to step up in this conflict. We already know that Augustine says, no, the problem is the will. You can't say you've got the power to choose. Huh. In fact, St. Augustine taught that humans, yeah, they were free, all right. They were free to choose, but they were free to choose only to sin. Bondage of the will. Pelagius said, no, 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 that's ridiculous. He retorted that Augustine's anthropology was just all wrong. Bad habits were, in Pelagian thinking, the result of social conditioning, and they could be reversed. And Augustine had no time for it. So we look at it this way. Augustine says humans inherit sin from Adam. Pelagius said, no, they don't. Humans sin because of Adam. See, the example, social conditioning. We see people sin, so we sin too. You see the distinction here. Augustin said humans cannot act righteously. Pelagius said humans are free to act righteous if they would simply choose to do so. Augustin retorted, the penalty of sin is physical death. Pelagius said it is not. Death is natural. There's no connection between death and sin. Augustin said in his famous aphorism in Latin, non posse non peccare, it is not possible not to sin. Not possible not to sin. And Pelagius said, nonsense. It is possible to do good. Now you can see a big intellectual and doctrinal battle coming together here. This is night and day, black and white. Augustin taught predestination. God chooses us for salvation. Pelagius said, no, God has foreknowledge about who will be saved. God does not predetermine. Augustin said, we are apprehended by God's grace. Pelagius said, we cooperate with God. The list could in fact go on. But in his struggle with the Pelagians, Augustine developed theological ideas on subjects such as predestination, original sin, and grace. His teaching on those 3 points would be profoundly significant as church history develops into those Middle Ages. The Pelagians ultimately were accused of promoting the idea of sinlessness. Accused, I say, of promoting an idea of sinlessness. And no need really for divine grace. And the idea of a free will, that is the human ability to choose. Well, what St. Augustine taught in distinction, and I would argue out of his confrontation with the Pelagian movement, was that God bestows special grace on people. More grace on some people and less grace on other people, but notwithstanding, it is God who bestows the grace. Pelagius said, no, 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 it's not special grace at all. It's natural grace. And it's sufficient, this natural grace which is evenly bestowed upon everybody. It is more than sufficient to bring humans to perfection if they will just use it. And this is a problem. They won't choose to use it. And Augustine says they can't. We can't choose. That's the problem. So there was no meeting of the minds between Augustine and Pelagius. While the Pelagians encouraged people to grow into full spiritual adulthood, and they believed they could, Augustine emphasized that as Christians we're just like little babies, human babies, who are helpless, who are dependent upon God for practically everything. And without God, we little infant Christians can only struggle with the idea of maturity. Well, the matter became, as you might suspect, an ongoing and a long-standing debate. Eventually, Pelagianism was banished altogether from the empire and formally condemned at the Council of Ephesus in the year 431. The methods used against the Donatists previously had proved so successful they were implemented here again, and the Pelagians were invited to either straighten up or get lost. And as most groups who don't think they're wrong, heretics seldom admit that they're heretics, said, you guys are wrong, we're not straightening up, you need to straighten up. And so Pelagianism kind of went down the sideline of church history. And then the Council of Orange in the year 529. Orange was a Roman town in Gaul, present-day France, on the lower Rhone River. At that council in 529, semi-Pelagianism was condemned. And I think you can guess just from the term what semi-Pelagianism means. That there's part of Pelagianism that, yes, we do play a bit of a role in salvation. The church said, no, you don't. The fall has corrupted all of humankind, so I have to declare the winner in this conflict to be Augustine and the councils that followed his teaching, which put to an end Pelagianism. Well, there remains now, I think, finally, to comment briefly upon the influence of St. Augustine. His vivid description of the saga of humankind was dominant through the Middle Ages. I don't think there's any question about that. His attitudes on subjects like original sin, sacramental grace, sexuality, and human nature were foundational. And it's very difficult to move around in medieval theology in these areas without bumping into the ghost of St. Augustine. His ideas of the just war were appealed to again and again and again. And one might even argue that such appeals continue right on down in the Western world to the 21st century. His driving social theories urged the maintenance of social structure and hierarchy. He taught very clearly the soul over the body, husbands over wives, rulers over subjects. And these likewise were far-reaching in their scope as church history became more institutionalized in the European Middle Ages. Like Origen, Augustine was a voluminous writer. As he was not a systematic writer, his ideas on numerous subjects are scattered through his many books. Most important, in terms of his influence, was his grand theme of creation, the fall, redemption, ultimate completion, and salvation, a scheme that permeated the religious sensibilities of the West. In his old age, in either the year 426 or the year 427, he composed his Retractations, or to give them a little bit more palatable title, Reconsiderations, a book he entitled Reconsiderations. It's valuable, this book, especially for pointing out how his mind had changed. There's very few of us who like to do this, that we become entrenched in our ideas. Augustine decided to have a rethink about it. And he began writing this book about how my mind has changed, various issues through my life. It's a useful reminder, if we think about it theologically, that thought itself often has a life of its own, and it undergoes development. The Christian is ever the pilgrim, moving on towards the prize of oneness with God, of salvation, of enlightenment, and never to assume that one has arrived. One of the dilemmas in church history is that pilgrims want to become settlers. They get to a certain place and they decide, this is the place. Let us stop right here and settle down. Augustine said, we're always pilgrims, and my mind has changed on some issues. Augustine's Reconsiderations corrects what previously he considered inappropriate or incorrect. And some scholars regard the Augustinian Reconsiderations as a long and detailed examination of conscience. Augustine was still alive in the year 430 as the Vandals were besieging his hometown of Hippo. It is reported that he took little note of this, little note of the calamity occurring around him, preferring instead to ultimately separate himself from earthly goods and concerns. He died in August 430 while reading the penitential Psalms. Augustine's theology had a continuing influence, and his ideas dominated the Christian church up until the 13th century, when another Christian giant, Thomas Aquinas, resurrected Aristotle. But be that as it may, Augustine of Hippo is the only church father who remains an intellectual power to this day.